morning. Apparently, it's a very good morning because you guys have a lot of life. That makes me feel good. I'm glad to know that you're alive and well today. In this day that the Lord has made. This morning, it's my pleasure to introduce to you our speaker for our Windows on the World series. Our speaker today is Dr. Gwen White. Dr. White is our director of the Doctor of Arts in Marriage and Family Counseling at Eastern University. She is a licensed psychologist, and in 1997, she founded Circle Counseling, a counseling center in West Philadelphia offering professional mental health services grounded in faith. Dr. White earned her B.A. from the University of California, Riverside, her M.A. in counseling from Eastern University, and her Psy.D. That's right, yeah. See, people get those degrees. And her Psy.D. from Immaculata University in clinical psychology. Having served at the hospital of the University of Pennsylvania in the neuropsychology wing of rehabilitative medicine, her research interests include the application of neuroscience to helping relationships, counselor training and supervision, spirituality and counseling practice, mentoring relationships, compassion fatigue, trauma and religious experience. She has trained therapists internationally in the identification and treatment of compassion fatigue and in integrating spirituality into therapeutic practice. She and her husband live in West Philadelphia and enjoy their 4 adult sons and their growing families. So with that, I introduce to some and present to others none other than Eastern University's own Dr. Gwen White.
I'm hoping I'm coming through on this lapel mic. Paul told me I'd sound like I have a weird voice, so I hope you're going to be okay hearing me. Some of us come to Eastern and just can't leave, and that's probably my case. Also, 3 of those dear sons of mine are also alumni of this wonderful institution. So Eastern's been very good to us. What I hope you take away from this morning is a pause button, maybe is what I might call it, for your own process as you think about what you do when you pray, what you do when you encounter hard relationships, what you do when there's too much stress, what you do when you're thinking about how to make life good, better, best, whatever those kinds of thoughts are for you. I've listened to a lot of folks over the years that my practice has been going, and many of them come to us at our counseling center because they are interested in trying to sort out psychological as well as spiritual issues. And so I was sort of looking around in the psychology literature for some way to find a handle, some help to offer to many of these very devout and sincere people who were experiencing real difficulty. And some of that came from life experience. Some were victims of various kinds of trauma. Others, when Deborah was introducing me, she put together words that, you know when somebody introduces you, you're like, who really are they talking about? And she put together spiritual and trauma. And I thought that's interesting, because I think some of the clients that I have sat with over the years might, in retrospect, say that they were spiritually traumatized. And so it became an interest to me. As a longtime reader of C.S. Lewis, I came across a very brief quote here from Lewis, and it seemed to make so much sense to me as I was listening to these folks talk about their religious experience and some of their emotional quagmires, the places they got stuck. In the case for Christianity, Lewis talks about badness is only spoiled goodness. And for those of you who also love Lewis, he's fond of talking about how a good tool, when it's bent, is no longer helpful. And much of what we experience in our fallen world leaves us in this position where we're using a lot of bent tools. In fact, the metaphor might be best said that you and I are bent tools. And so when we are living our lives then, it's very possible that the thing that was once good, used of God, helpful, becomes problematic. And I sort of want to unpack that this morning and see where we go with that. There was a woman at a funeral, and she commented about her dear friend. She would have had a different she would have been a different person if she'd had a different God. I thought that was really insightful. The deceased woman had been a devout person, but a person who couldn't find joy, a person who couldn't seem to access what was good about the gospel, only the duty and the rule and the obligation. And so she lived a rather repressed and even difficult life. In the psychological literature, as I began looking in the corners, there was this term called spiritual bypass. It was hidden away in some of the addiction literature. Folks who were coming to AA and talking about their higher power and talking about what it meant to try to leave behind these very self-destructive and difficult patterns in their lives, would get stuck because they were using the good they had initially found in this higher power to actually keep themselves sort of unaware that they were really experiencing a variety of difficulties. Without naming those difficulties then, they became more and more mired in them. And so I sort of grabbed this term, spiritual bypass, because I thought it had good handles, that you could talk with people who didn't want to read all the stuff I was reading. So what I'm hoping is to unpack that term and kind of encourage you, I think, in ways that I hope you might use it in your own spiritual growth, and then open up for questions if you have them. So, from our biblical language, the psychologists long time ago decided that one of the main experiences of us human beings is that we experience life in two sorts of ways. Very basically, all of you who are psych students, and I know some of you have been told to be here by my friends who are your instructors, we experience life from the perspective of, I know this stuff is going on, and we've called that consciousness, and then there's this other stuff happening in my brain that we can now even take pictures of that I don't know that's going on, and we call that the unconscious. So there's been this bifurcation that cuts right through the middle of us. Seems to me that that might be one of the early ear signs, or earmarks that we all might have, that yeah, we're sinners. Our experience is even fragmented. Not only are we cut off from God by what it means to be alive in this world these days, in the brokenness that we all could attest to in 100 ways, but we don't even know ourselves. We end up in situations where we say, I don't know why I said that. Or worse yet, sometimes, oh, I really wished I hadn't done that. There's conscious and unconscious experience. Well, the scripture was ripe with this stuff, at least from the way I was reading it. Back in the Old Testament, the heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Who can understand it? A rather honest appraisal, isn't it? I mean, wouldn't you admit, yeah, I get that. In Romans, Paul had this famous passage that we all kind of like to come back to, but my mind was drawn back to it in relation to this issue of conscious and unconscious thought and to spiritual bypass. I don't understand what I do. What I really don't want to do is what I do. And what I really wish I didn't do, that's what I do. I do crazy things. And I'm not very comfortable thinking of myself as crazy, and there's reason for that too. From the psychological language, then, let me unpack this a bit more. There are contents of our minds, mental contents, that we simply don't tolerate well. We don't experience ourselves as being some negative things, like I don't like to think of myself as an angry person, and yet there are times certainly when I am an angry person. Sometimes I don't know that very well, and my anger flares in a situation that is less than what might provoke what comes out of me. The way that human beings develop, we are putting together ourselves. The literature, even in some quadrants, calls it the construction of the self. Some postmodern folks around the sciences of all kinds really talk about now how reality is more constructed than real. I'm not sure I'm ready to go all the way there. I think we have a real God, and I don't think he just lives in me. But my experience of him in the day-to-day is deeply impacted by how I've tried to put myself together and hold myself together, because that's the container that I've got. There are these unconscious organizational patterns in me that have grown out of my earliest experiences. And as those have rooted in me, then I am, in some sense, living out of them when I don't even know it. And psychology, I would say, one way to talk about psychology anyway, is we've been trying to unpack that mystery since the beginning of our discipline. So we have these unintegrated states in us that this isn't what I want to think of myself, except when I have to, when someone holds up a mirror and I see it, right? And so these thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that come out of me are parts of this unconscious being that is still me, part of me. But it makes me very anxious to have to deal with all of that, and so I'm built psychologically. I have defenses. I have ways of not noticing the things about me that not only make me uncomfortable, but generate this kind of anxiety. So from my early development, I take in what's going on around me. Let me try to unpack this with a bit of an example. Suppose a little girl is born into a family that really values hard work. And so from her earliest experience, the kinds of affirmations that she receives are around, oh, look at you, you put away that dish. Would you help mommy take this to the trash? And so without her mom's really thinking about it, the message is going deep within this little being that is forming that doing work is the heart and soul of being alive and healthy and well and functioning. And so you can see how that could be a very good thing, right? You all need to get your homework done. You all need to be, kind to your roommates. You need to do a lot of things that are about how you negotiate a world, and a lot of them involve doing some hard work, doing something that maybe isn't the first thing you want to do, but you get the task done, you try to understand the other person's perspective, you work at it. So as she grows up, though, that very good thing becomes a deeply embedded pattern, and she can end up, as many who have come to visit me, as I've found even when I look in the mirror, she can end up struggling because everything is work. Her prayer in the morning is work. Her friends come to her because they want to know what she read in her psychology textbook last night, right? They want to know why or how she might be helpful to them, and she's got to be helpful to them because that's what good workers do. A good friend is someone who works hard for their friends. A good wife is someone who works hard for children, husband. And in that kind of framework, slowly what can happen is when she begins to feel less than good about herself, her unconscious reaction is to figure out, what do I need to do? How can I work harder at this? And what a lot of people who have that kind of orientation end up, why they end up seeing me, is because they're actually depressed. They're not able to sleep well anymore. Their eating patterns may have changed. They feel gloomy, and they feel terribly guilty about feeling gloomy. And when I suggest, I wonder if you're dealing with depression. Oh, no, I am not depressed. I'm a Christian. You are a Christian. But what you're describing is all the stuff. See, we even opened the DSM, our diagnostic manual. See, this is what it is. It's very hard to take that in because, one, it means maybe I'm crazy, and nobody wants to manage that, right? But it becomes very challenging to sort out from what was good what has become bad. And that's a lot of the work of therapy. We internalize these patterns, the ways that our caregivers meant good for us sometimes, or, unfortunately, did not. And out of that then grows a self that has organized around, how do I make it in the world, given what I've been given? And so the good can become spoiled. We end up seeing others and ourselves through these kinds of lenses that we put on. I'm fond of doing this old cognitive therapy joke with my students, because I'll often say, I've got a lovely yellow lemon here. It's just beautiful. And I set it down, and then I talk about how I have glasses now with a really blue lens. And so I'm looking through my blue lens at this lovely yellow, ripe lemon. I can smell it. What color is the lemon? What color is the lemon? It's still yellow. It looks green, doesn't it? That's the joke. Yeah, see, you did it. Very good. A+. So we end up with these lenses that cause us. We are stuck with this view. And until we learn to say, oh, yeah, I wear glasses, and we all wear glasses, and we wear glasses as Christians that cause us to see yellow lemons as green. Or you can vary that in any way that you need to. Lots of colors could apply there for you. Psychologists tell us that one of the primary achievements of our development from our little person to our adult person is getting this cohesive self to hang together. It's how I know I'm me and you're you, and how I can make my way through the world. And then maintenance of that self-organization is how I function well. It's how I know joy. It's how I know God. So we have to maintain that. But these developmental processes have left me with a lens, or in Lewis's language, perhaps a bent tool. And anything that comes up that would point out that I'm looking at a green world instead of the actual world, well, that's threatening because I've tried to figure things out the very best I could. And so unconsciously, I repress is the language that we psychologists use, or I defend against even knowing the truth about myself and others. Much of my Christian journey, I think, has been this attempt, a deepening attempt to understand human motivation, my own and those of the folks who seek help from me. And it's really been, I think, this journey into paradox. Christianity is really full of paradox, and I think we're up against a fundamental one when we talk about spiritual bypass. I never talk to a group of people without talking about one of my grandchildren, so here comes your story. I'm going to wake Deborah up. She's a brand new grandma, Noni. I'm a Nana. She's a Noni. Brendan is 3 years old, and he came to his mom, and he said to her, "Mom, does Daddy get his strength from God?" And if you met Brendan, it's really like that. It's sort of attacking the world with every question. It's this little, every bit of this kid is muscle. And he says, is that how Daddy got his strength? And his mom, wanting to affirm faith early on in this child's life, oh yes, Brendan, Daddy is strong because God has given him his strength. So Mom, do you think I'm strong because I got my strength from God? Oh yes, Brendan, God gave you your beautiful body. You are strong because God has given you this. Brendan frowned and was not having it, and he finally looked back at his mom and he said, "Mom, I exercise a lot, and that is why I'm strong." I should have brought you a picture too. You could just see him say it. But anyway, he's right, and his mom is right. And I think that's kind of the crux of the paradox. He's right and he's wrong. His question gets at the heart of this deep issue for us as Christians. What of our growth and healing is up to us? And what is gift from God? God gave Brendan that little body that I love so much, but Bren is very active in exercising that body and making it strong. And this collaborative effort, co-workers with God, Paul talks about it, I believe, in 2 Corinthians. That means that we're in this lifelong journey of entering this mystery of how we finite beings interact with the infinite God. And we're going to hit these places over and over again. And when we talk about spiritual bypass, I think we're exploring this very mystery and particularly encountering the places where we need to understand ourselves and our motives in ways that we're not aware of. And the reality that psychology has taught me is that we are all set up to not look at that, to defend against knowing, to defend against bringing into consciousness the things that bring us pain, the things that cause us to be unsettled, the depths of that mystery of this interaction with God. Because have you noticed in your faith walk yet that, some things don't just look like 2 and 2 is 4? That you pray for one thing and it happens and you're overjoyed that God has done this for you, and you pray for another and it doesn't happen? And it doesn't happen over and over, and when it's really important, the health of a loved one, the end of a war, whatever you pray about, sometimes, many times, it doesn't happen. And we are jarred by these experiences. We need to figure out more about what it means that we're co-workers, laborers with God. So one more bit from psychology. I don't want to end up repeating myself here, but I think the psychological literature kind of repeats itself. In the cognitive world especially, they will teach us about how our brains work, and that we are processing information all the time. And the problem is, though, that we are vulnerable to these information processing systems becoming biased. We select out of our experiences what proves our beliefs. And this gets, the research is just voluminous on this. We pick out what confirms what we believe, and we don't even see what might disconfirm it out of our environments. We don't actually rationally choose things very much. There is this great mixture of emotion, of all kinds of processes within us that impact us daily, moment to moment. And all these complex interactions between many of the brain systems leave us in a bit of a dilemma, in more of this paradox that Brendan was playing around with, where we can take this good that we have been given and somehow get quite confused. We end up using the very belief systems that announce the good news to the deepest parts of ourselves for spiritual bypass. I would say that it's particularly rooted, or maybe what I would suggest is that a way for you to catch yourself doing this and therefore find more of the truth, and we all know that the truth sets us free, right? To know this is to grow. And so if all of these reactions and interactions in our lives are being colored by a lot of stuff we don't know about ourselves, then I would contend that learning more about yourself, being open to that which might surprise you in yourself, is a good way to develop spiritually as well as in all other ways. So we unconsciously shape all these interactions, including those with God. So when I have somebody sitting in my office and she's depressed and she's telling me about what she does every day, and I finally get to the end of her long litany of things that she's done, and I might say something really intelligent like, wow, that's a lot. And there's often surprise. Well, it's just what has to be done. Yeah, but it seems like a lot. That it's a surprise. Well, yeah, but things have to be done. And often we begin to tap into some emotion at that point, because there is this conviction that I have to do all of this if I am to please this God who I so want to please. And if we unpack that enough, we get back to taking that little bit of trash to the trash can when she's 18 months old, although we don't form long-term memory yet at that point. But we get this pattern of over and over how important it was to do well. And so she has to begin to explore with me. We have to find the way to name these deep hurts that are around having to what? Earn love, isn't it? So her experiences with God are at an unconscious level about earning God's love over and over, day after day. And no wonder she's depressed, right? But freedom will come when she can say, I got that wrong. I got it wrong in these ways. I was hurt in these ways. And as I'm moving forward, maybe I need to sleep in instead of pray. And I might say something like, sleep in instead of pray. What would happen? Tell me more about that. And we begin to talk about where God might meet her, where she's at, not where she wishes she were at. We begin to unpack how she hears every sermon that she hears, every talk in Windows on the World or at chapel, through this lens that says, do more. And she's going to meet God when she can finally stop and meet him. It doesn't mean she'll never do any good works, right? This is back to Brendan's paradox. Back to the paradoxes of our faith. Faith without works is dead. Let me tell you about dead faith, though, driving people to work, because I see a lot of it. That's spiritual bypass. I can't unpack all of this because I want to make sure I save a few minutes, but let me go through just a little random New Testament wandering with Jesus and spiritual bypass that I think he encounters. So Mary in Luke 1 is greatly troubled when the angel comes upon her, and wouldn't you be, right? She has an idea of who she is. I am a virgin. I am a Jewish young woman who is not married, and I try to be good. And the angel begins to process with her that view of self, and then what God is going to do. He is really going to mess this up. And she has that remarkable ability, I think, to understand that she has to change her view of self. She can't use her religious convictions in the ways she has before. It doesn't mean that she abandons God. It means she takes him in the way he has come to her now. And don't we all thank God for it? Let it be to me as you have said. How about Peter in John 21 when Jesus meets him on the beach and asks him 3 times, "Do you love me?" It's almost like Peter is the puppy and he's done you know what on the floor and Jesus is rubbing his nose in it. Well, I mean, that's the weirdest kind of encounter. I don't like thinking of my Jesus as that sort of teacher. Peter, I think, though, is getting these layers stripped away. Do you love me? Jesus is helping him work down to these deeper points of emotion. And we get it a little bit in the text when the 3rd time he's asked, and he almost, I hear this sort of exasperation, "You know that I love you." Jesus is pushing Peter to change that deep sense of himself as the betrayer, as the, "Oh, I'm a sinful man." These are the things Peter has said to Jesus. And Jesus is coming back, and I think being the most lovely therapist of all, and stripping this away with Peter in a very experiential moment where Peter gets to finally, at the depth of his emotion, back into that place where he is mad, sad, bad. He's all of it. "I do love you." This is what you need to do, Peter. Go into the world and feed people who are really like little sheep. There's this shifting in the way I think Peter understands people. Remember, Peter didn't much like Matthew early on. Why? Well, Matthew was a sinner. We have to move with Jesus through these shifts in how we understand how our love of God will change us and will change how we move into the world and will change our lenses. And it keeps happening because any lens that I think is good enough always gets bent. And somehow it's always going to relate back to those early, early patterns that got established in me when I internalized my world, even as I was just learning to speak. Mary and Martha, we love Mary and Martha. Mary seems to have gotten this Mary now, the Mary who sits at Jesus' feet. She seems to have escaped the cultural lens. She gets it. Even though she's a woman, she gets to sit there and listen to Jesus. Why? Because that's the best thing to do. She is encountering the incarnate God, and there ain't nobody going to push her off the mark, even her beloved sister, even the tasks at hand. She has to go through this process of allowing what is new to hit her full force, to maybe even discombobulate her a bit. We see that even more in Martha, right? We all like the Martha story, especially those of you who related to my example of the young woman who tries to do well in all things. Martha tries to do well. And she thinks she knows her place and what she needs to do and what is proper and what is good, what is love. And Jesus reshapes that. I think he's saying, don't do it the way you have done it in the past. Find this new way in your encounter with me. I think the Pharisees were my first and best lens into what spiritual bypass is, because the good that they had been given is what they clung to, and so they could not see God in front of them. And that happens to all of us. I don't usually get mad at the Pharisees when I'm reading the New Testament. I think they show me what I'm capable of. And I would contend that that's a good way to grow. It's really helped me in my growth as a Christian to understand that I have a proclivity to do that very thing. Psychologically, it's rooted in me. Jesus' parables, I think, are made to try to shock his religious listeners into seeing themselves differently, seeing others differently, and especially about seeing God differently. And then this lovely story with the woman at the well. She knows that she's a foreigner. Her first response to Jesus is, hey, I'm a Samaritan and a woman. What are you talking to me for? She is right there. And Jesus doesn't even have a bucket. What are you talking about? And this conversation unfolds. And I think I'm not going to go through it step by step. I encourage you, go read that when you're sitting under a tree on this lovely day or at some point. And watch Jesus just strip away these points where she is trying to bypass him. Right? First, it's cultural. I'm a woman, and I'm a Samaritan. Jesus happens to notice the other reality. She's out at the well all by herself. That's not when women come to a well. Something else is up. And he begins to strip these things away and help her to name them. Jesus continues this conversation with her and asks her, well, go get your husband. Oh, well, I don't really have a husband. No, she doesn't. She's been with many men and doesn't have a husband. And Jesus is helping her work with what? Choices that she really doesn't want to admit to. She's being helped to go to a deeper sense of what this encounter is like. And then she turns to my favorite point. What does she turn to? Joe, she turns to theology, right? You know, what's worship about? Don't you have to worship on the, in the temple? Isn't that what you say? But my people say we worship over here. So she gets right back up in her head. And haven't we all been taught that? That to save our faith, we got to get right back up into our heads. Now, I'm not saying to go off and do all the things that might come to you at the whim. But I am saying that what psychology has taught us is that we must engage our emotion because no decision is made without it, even for those of us who like the Stoic orientation. And Jesus wants this woman to find something more and helps her. I'm going to get to some more questions here, so I'll just kind of flash these up and not say much about them, but I think you get my drift here, that we're up against this kind of bias that is right inside of us, and you see it, at least I see it all over in the scripture now when I look at these stories, but also in my own life and certainly in the lives of the folks who come to see me. So the good we do, the good things we think, the disciplines we try, all these can start out as helpful new steps along the spiritual way. They can also become the way we come to block our growth in unconscious ways because we're threatened psychologically. The good is spoiled and it becomes bad. Those of you in psychology classes, you're learning about attachment. Read about that and see how it applies. That's all I'm going to say. I was presenting this topic at a professional conference with other therapists, and one of the folks in the audience came up to me afterwards and said, "Gwen, don't you think spiritual bypass then is idolatry?" And I was a little scared, honestly, to just say yes. Because actually, yeah, I think that's part of it. We hold on to something that we think is working for us, and it kind of becomes like an idol. But that language gets us into so much other language that talks about me pulling myself up by my bootstraps and denying that which is reprehensible to God, and I can get right back in a task orientation. So I think it's careful parsing that we all have to do. It's living into Brendan's paradox. It's over and over again saying, well, yes, and it's also these things. So this mystery of Christ with us every day. Wilkie and Noreen Au are an interesting couple. He was a priest, she was a nun. Another story. They're now married and writing books about spiritual growth and formation, and I think they really have interesting stuff to say. They trained Jungian analysts as well, so quite an interesting crew. But they talk about this need to allow for meeting God any old everywhere. And I think that's the way we begin to wrestle with this thing, this spiritual bypass stuff in our lives. I started by saying, I hope I give you a pause button. I really think that's about all I can give you because I'm not exactly sure how this is going to work in you. If we could sit down over a cup of tea, which I would love to do, we might be able to talk about your life, and I might be able to hear from you and learn from you the ways this could be at work in your life as we talked about the ways you interact, the courses you choose. It comes out in so many places. But we unfortunately, I think, have come to mistrust ourselves so deeply. And I think you could listen to everything I've said and think that what I'm saying is you ought to mistrust yourself, right? Because you're a victim of spiritual bypass. I'd much rather you go away feeling empowered to just look at yourself, to wonder, to pause and wonder, and to let maybe prayer filter into that wondering space so that you wonder about what you really want in the world. You know, that word will is closely associated with our word yearning. God's will for you is all bound up in his yearning for you to be in this love relationship that will continue to set you free, not once and done. And not just because he gives you a gift and you go make that little body strong, because he's interacting all the time, back and forth in this co-labor of love, in your development as well as your work in the world. So I'll leave you with this image. I probably don't need to say anything more. That's the image. I think we are her every day. And we're looking back at what got us out there in the middle of the air. And you know, there are moments when that feels so great, and there are moments when that feels terrifying. And of course, we're looking back because we have to, because you had to let go. And now there you are, floating out there and hoping this guy is a really good athlete. Kierkegaard said it well, leap, leap into the arms of a waiting God. I think spiritual bypass demands that we figure that out day upon day. Hit the pause button and wonder. That's all I got. What would you like to ask, comment, disagree? I'm wide open to what you might want to do with the next bit. Or we're going to go home. Oh, sorry, please.
How do we as believers reconcile like the very human qualities of intuition and just gut instinct with the newness of being changed by Jesus?
You need to be a psychologist. That's a burgeoning field.
That's a big question.
Yeah, well, it's a big question. His question was how do we reckon with our intuitive gut feelings and then being made new in Christ? I would suggest that you pause and wonder over those gut feelings. It's an interesting literature that's opening up, and I'm far from an expert in psychology, on intuition and gut feelings. In fact, the Psychology Monitor just had a cover story on that very, very topic, so it's hitting almost the pop shelf level now. But what we're finding out is there is much wisdom there, much, much wisdom in those deep intuitive moments. I wouldn't want to live my life based on them, but I would not want to live my life without them. And so my suggestion would be that we get a little less afraid that we're going to do something wrong, and we take that right into our prayer. God, I have this sense that I'm supposed to do this, or I'm not supposed to do that. I can't even explain it. Help me sort this out. Trusting that God really is within us, but He's going to use our community of faith. He's going to use Scripture. He's going to use the Holy Spirit. It's all around and within, and so it's this dialogic process that we're always going through. Challenging, always challenging. Because it's the next thing that God's always about. At least that's the way He does it in my life. Thank you. Way back.
So it seems that someone is Christian, but their faith has been blunted, that they don't believe God anymore. And so how could you approach them and use God? Because when they hear the word of God, they don't want to hear it. So how do you approach that?
I would talk with them about all their experiences. I want to know what happened to them. Something happened to them. They need somebody to listen to that story. And I have a pretty strong conviction after sitting in the room with folks for so many years now that, God was in the room before I got there, and God was with them before I heard their tragic story or whatever. And so I've got to trust that He's going to be doing work I can't. You make me think of something that just happened this week for me with a young person that I have known for a very long time who was deeply troubled when she first came to see me, and because of a horrendous abuse in her childhood. And we've unpacked that. She's gone out and lived her life. She's back to see me again, and she's telling me something new now about that horrific experience. And I don't know why it took her all that time. I mean, I thought I did some pretty good work earlier, but here we are back at the same place. And so I really kind of have to take my own deep breath and say, tell me about this. Human beings process emotion in interesting ways. What really makes us sick, though, is when we try not to process it. And so my pastor husband likes to say to the atheists, yeah, well, tell me about that. I'm not afraid of your atheism. I don't think I believe in your atheism. But let's talk. And I think for a long time, we in the Christian community, we've had what I think is just a mistaken notion that we have to say something. We have to proclaim the truth as if we can make a good argument and that's what's going to save them. So my atheist friends, my friends who have lost their belief, I've got to argue them up against the wall. And you know what? They are sick of that. They are tired of that. They are confirmed in their disbelief by that. Love works better. And listening. They'll help you find the way. And it's not, you know, the other thing I think is too often we, in our spiritual bypass, are very activated. Our emotions are up. Like we have a responsibility to get this person back in the fold. I got to carry this sheep back. And so I'm acting out of stuff in me that I may not be aware of. It's much better to take the breath. Pause even there. Thank you for that question. I think we have to get out of here pretty quick. It's about 10 till, so thank you all so much.